A single piece of ancient linen holds one of history's greatest secrets. This is the Shroud of Turin, and its mystery is a perfect storm of faith, science, and historical intrigue. We're going to dive deep into the evidence, separating compelling science from centuries of controversy. By the end, you will possess a clear understanding of the facts that both challenge and defend this legendary cloth. How was an image of a crucified man encoded onto the fibers without any known pigment? And why does a medieval carbon dating result clash so violently with other forensic evidence? What do you believe is more powerful, an undeniable fact or an unshakable mystery? Our story truly begins in the small French town of Liéry, around the year 1354. A powerful knight, Geoffroy de Charny, presented a linen cloth to his local church. The cloth bore the faint, haunting image of a man who had suffered crucifixion, front and back. This was not a quiet discovery. Almost immediately, the relic sparked intense debate and drew pilgrims from across the region. People were captivated by the visceral, ghostly impression of a tortured body. Yet this fervent devotion quickly alarmed the local religious authorities. The Bishop of Troyes, Henry de Poitiers, launched an investigation. He was deeply skeptical, and after looking into the matter, he declared the shroud a clever piece of work, a painting created through human cunning to profit from the faithful. This was the first official record of the Shroud of Turin, and it was born not in reverence, but in controversy. To understand why this happened, we must look at the world of the 14th century. Europe was still reeling from the Black Death, a plague that had killed millions and shaken the foundations of society. In this atmosphere of profound uncertainty and spiritual yearning, people clung to physical objects that promised a direct connection to the divine. Relics, from slivers of the true cross to bones of saints, were powerful draws for pilgrimage and donations. For a local church or a noble family like the de Charnys, owning a major relic could bring immense prestige and economic prosperity. The bishop's condemnation was likely a reaction to this very phenomenon. He saw a potentially fraudulent object creating a cult following outside the official control of the church, a threat to both doctrinal purity and his own authority. So from its very first appearance, the shroud was caught between the passionate faith of the people and the cautious scrutiny of the institution. How could something that looked so authentic to so many be dismissed so confidently by a high-ranking cleric? The stage was set for a mystery that would only deepen with time. The ghostly figure on the linen is not painted in any conventional sense. It is a faint, straw-colored stain, a delicate searing of the very topmost fibers of the cloth. To the naked eye, the image appears as a blur, a smudge of ancient sepia. But when you look closer, the details begin to emerge with startling clarity. You see the form of a naked man, front and back, as if the cloth had been laid over him from head to toe and then folded back over his feet. His hands are crossed, one over the other, resting low on his pelvis. And his body tells a story of brutal suffering. From head to toe, the man is covered in what appear to be small, dumbbell-shaped wounds, consistent with the Roman flagrum, a whip embedded with pieces of metal or bone. There is a large wound on his side, as if pierced by a spear. His feet show a single wound, suggesting they were nailed together over a single wooden stake. Most haunting of all is the head, where dozens of small, puncture-like marks circle the scalp and forehead, matching the description of a crown of thorns. But the true mystery of the image lay hidden for centuries. It was only with the invention of photography that its secret was revealed. In 1898, an amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was allowed to take the first official photographs of the shroud. As he developed the glass plate negatives in his darkroom, he experienced a shock that would change the course of shroud research forever. The negative plate he held in his hands did not show a negative image. Instead, it showed a perfectly clear, positive, and highly detailed portrait of a man. This meant the shroud itself is a natural negative. The faint stains on the cloth encode a perfect, three-dimensional photographic negative image, a concept completely unknown in the medieval world. How could a forger, centuries before the camera was invented, create an image that only makes perfect sense when seen as its own negative? Secondo Pia stared into his developing tray, his breath catching in his throat. He was an amateur, a local lawyer given an incredible honor, and now he feared he had ruined everything. The glass negative plate he had just exposed to the Shroud of Turin should have shown a faint, ghostly smear. Instead, as the chemicals worked their magic in the dim red light, a face began to emerge. It was not the vague, sepia-toned impression he had seen on the cloth itself. This was something entirely different, something impossibly clear and starkly real. The image swimming up from the chemical bath was a perfect, lifelike, positive portrait of a man with a serene yet sorrowful expression. In that single, heart-stopping moment, Pia realized the truth. The shroud itself was not the final picture. It was the master negative. For centuries, people had been looking at the equivalent of a photographic negative, a coded image that only revealed its full, breathtaking detail when its own negative was created. The faint stains on the linen were not random. They were a perfect inversion of light and shadow, holding a three-dimensional map of a human body. This was not a skill any medieval painter could have possessed. How do you paint a perfect negative of a human form centuries before the concept of photography, or even optics, was understood? Pia's photograph did more than just startle one man in a darkroom. It fundamentally transformed the shroud's entire narrative. Overnight, it was catapulted from a curious and often doubted local relic into a global phenomenon demanding rigorous scientific investigation. The question was no longer simply, is this authentic? It became, what incredible, unknown process could have created this? Pia's photograph was a thunderclap, but science demanded more than a single revelation. Decades later, a new team arrived in Turin, armed not with faith, but with spectrometers and microscopes. This was the Shroud of Turin Research Project, a group of over 30 American scientists, from physicists to pathologists, granted 120 uninterrupted hours with the Relic in 1978. Their mission was simple and profound: to subject the linen to the most rigorous, non-destructive testing modern science could offer. They came not as believers or skeptics, but as detectives approaching the ultimate cold case. For 5 intense days, they worked in shifts around the clock inside the royal palace, their instruments humming in the quiet chamber. They used X-ray fluorescence to probe for chemical elements. They employed ultraviolet spectrometry to analyze the cloth's reflectance. They peered through high-power microscopes at individual flax fibers, searching for any trace of a pigment, a binder, or a brushstroke. They mapped the image in 3 dimensions, confirming its encoded spatial information. The team was systematically dismantling the possibility of forgery, one hypothesis at a time. If this was a painting, it would have required a medieval Leonardo da Vinci to have knowledge of photography, advanced chemistry, and human anatomy that simply did not exist. Their collective findings were unequivocal. The image was not painted on. There were no pigments, no dyes, no medium of any kind that could account for the coloration. The color resided only on the very topmost microfibers, a superficial change more akin to a scorch than an application of paint. The STURP team's official conclusion was a stunning admission of ignorance. They stated that the image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The causes of the image, however, remain unknown. Science had eliminated the how of a forgery, but in doing so, it had only deepened the mystery of the how of its creation. just when the scientific case for the shroud's authenticity seemed stronger than ever, a new test delivered a devastating blow. The year was 1988, and after years of negotiation, the Vatican approved a radical procedure, radiocarbon dating. This method measures the decay of a radioactive form of carbon in organic material, providing a reliable estimate of its age. To ensure an unbiased result, a strict protocol was followed. A single, postage stamp-sized piece of linen was carefully cut from a corner of the shroud. This precious sample was then divided into 3 parts and sent under blind conditions to 3 of the world's most respected laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson. The scientific community held its breath, awaiting a verdict they expected to be final. When the results came in, they were unanimous and shocking. All 3 labs independently concluded that the flax used to weave the Shroud of Turin had been harvested between the years 1260 and 1390. This placed the cloth's origin squarely in the medieval period, right around the time it first appeared in historical records in Lyre. For much of the world, the case was closed. Headlines around the globe declared the shroud a brilliant but undeniable medieval forgery. The scientific marvel that had baffled the Stirp team was now dismissed as the clever handiwork of a 13th century con artist. The carbon dating result was a clean, simple, and seemingly irrefutable fact. It appeared to reduce centuries of mystery to a single damning number. How could a cloth from the Middle Ages bear the image of a 1st century crucifixion victim? The faithful were left reeling, and skeptics felt vindicated. Yet, for a small group of researchers, the story was far from over. The very finality of the carbon date seemed to clash violently with the mountain of unexplained evidence that had come before it. Could one test truly erase all the other mysteries? Yet the finality of that carbon date was a sledgehammer that could not simply be ignored. It demanded an explanation, and a community of scientists and researchers took up the challenge, not with blind faith, but with a meticulous re-examination of the evidence itself. The first and perhaps most compelling challenge centers on the sample used for the test. The piece of linen cut from the shroud was taken from a single outer corner, an area that is visibly different from the main body of the cloth. This corner shows more pronounced staining and damage. Critics proposed that this section might not be part of the original 1st century cloth at all, but rather a clever, nearly invisible medieval repair. In the centuries before modern textiles, a technique known as reweaving was common practice. Skilled weavers would repair a damaged section of precious fabric by expertly interlacing new threads with the old, creating a patch that was almost impossible to detect with the naked eye. If the sample taken in 1988 was cut from such a medieval repair patch, then the carbon dating would simply be telling us the age of the repair, not the age of the original shroud. This is not just speculation. Subsequent microscopic analysis of thread samples from the same area, preserved on the original sticky tapes used by the Stirp scientists, revealed the presence of cotton fibers mixed in with the linen. The main shroud is pure linen, so the presence of cotton strongly suggests a later, foreign material was introduced into that specific corner, potentially during a repair. Another line of inquiry focuses on the fire the shroud survived in 1532. A devastating blaze in the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry, France, nearly destroyed the relic. It was kept in a silver casket, which melted in the intense heat, dripping molten metal onto the folded cloth and scorching it severely. Scientists question whether such a traumatic event could have fundamentally altered the cloth's chemistry. The intense heat could have caused a chemical reaction, infusing the linen fibers with carbon monoxide from the smoky fire. Since radiocarbon dating measures carbon isotopes, a massive infusion of new carbon from a medieval fire could have made the ancient linen appear hundreds of years younger than it actually is. Laboratory experiments have since shown that heating linen can indeed skew carbon dates toward a more modern result. So the question remains, did the carbon dating labs measure the true age of the cloth, or did they measure the chemical aftermath of its near destruction? These are not minor quibbles, but serious scientific arguments that cast a long shadow of doubt over what was once presented as an indisputable fact. The medieval date, once a case-closing verdict, now looks more like a single piece of a puzzle that stubbornly refuses to fit. So we are left with a profound contradiction, a medieval date stamped on an object that science insists could not have been made by medieval hands. This forces us to confront the shroud's deepest and most baffling mystery, the nature of the image itself. What exactly is it, and what impossible process could have created it? The closer scientists look, the stranger the image becomes. It is not a painting. It is not a scorch from direct heat. It is not a stain from any liquid. The coloration is a superficial degradation of the linen's cellulose fibers, affecting only the very topmost microthreads. Think of it not as paint applied to the surface of the cloth, but as a delicate chemical change to the very surface of the threads themselves, as if they were individually and precisely aged. This explains why there is no capillary action, no wicking of a liquid into the cloth. A liquid, any liquid, would have seeped between the threads, blurring the lines and creating a fuzzy, indistinct image. The shroud's image, by contrast, is razor sharp. The bloodstains, confirmed by multiple tests to be real human blood, show this capillary flow perfectly. They are smeared and blotched. But the body image itself shows none of this. It sits perfectly on the surface, a ghost that refuses to bleed. So how do you change the chemistry of linen threads so precisely without a liquid, a brush, or direct contact with a heated object? One leading theory points to a Maillard reaction. This is the same chemical process that browns the crust of bread or sears a steak. It is a reaction between sugars and amino acids, often driven by heat. Some researchers propose that a brief, intense burst of energy, perhaps a form of radiation, could have caused a rapid Maillard reaction on the surface of the cloth, dehydrating the cellulose fibers and turning them that specific straw yellow color. This would account for the image's superficial nature and its remarkable detail. Another, more radical, theory suggests a form of directed radiation. The image contains a perfect, three-dimensional data set of a human body. The darkness of the stain corresponds precisely to the distance between the cloth and the body, as if the intensity of the image forming energy diminished with space. To some, this points to a momentary, flash-like release of energy emanating from the body itself, a phenomenon that somehow encoded a perfect, photographic negative onto the linen. Yet despite decades of effort, no one has been able to fully reproduce the shroud's image with all its unique properties. You can create a faint, superficial stain, but not one with the same chemical signature, the same three-dimensional information, and the same resistance to fading over centuries. The process remains a perfect locked door in science. It is a phenomenon that, according to our current understanding, should not exist. So we must ask, if it was not a forger's trick, what incredible event left this permanent, inexplicable shadow of a man? While the body image remains an unsolved chemical puzzle, the bloodstains present a different kind of mystery, one that is starkly physical and visceral. The dark, rusty brown stains that mark the wounds on the hands, feet, and side are not part of the faint, superficial body image. They are something else entirely, and they were the first element scientists from the Shroud of Turin research project tested. Using a technique called reflectance spectroscopy, they analyzed the light reflected off these stains. The results were immediate and startling. The spectral signature was a perfect match for oxidized iron, a key component of hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying molecule in blood. But iron alone could be from paint, like red ochre, so they dug deeper. Later, more sensitive immunological tests were performed on material lifted from the blood areas using sticky tapes. These tests returned positive for human albumin, a primary protein in blood serum, and for bilirubin, a substance that increases in the bloodstream under conditions of extreme physical trauma. The presence of bilirubin is particularly telling. It is a compound produced by the breakdown of red blood cells, and its levels can skyrocket in a person who has suffered a brutal, prolonged torture like a scourging. This is not the profile of a simple paint. It is the complex chemical fingerprint of real human blood from a severely traumatized individual. Yet, the placement of this blood creates a paradox that challenges simple explanations. Medical examiners and forensic pathologists have long studied the flow patterns. The wounds on the forearms, for instance, show rivulets of blood that run at distinct angles, consistent with a person hanging upright on a cross, their arms stretched and bearing weight. The flows from the side wound show a clear separation between a more watery fluid and a thicker, clotted blood, matching the description in biblical accounts of blood and water flowing from a spear thrust. The blood from the scalp wounds mats the hair in precise streams, tracing a path a liquid would take through real hair. The anatomical accuracy is, in many ways, impeccable. But here is the truly baffling part, the detail that turns everything upside down. Under high-powered microscopes, scientists made a crucial observation. The bloodstains lie underneath the body image. The straw-colored fibers that form the ghostly picture of the body go right up to the edges of the bloodstains, but they do not cover them. This means the blood was on the cloth first. The image of the body was then formed around the pre-existing blood. Think about what this implies for the forgery theory. A medieval artist would have had to begin by meticulously applying real human blood, or a perfect chemical mimic, to a linen cloth in anatomically perfect patterns. They would have needed to understand forensic blood spatter and the physiology of crucifixion centuries before such sciences existed. Then, after the blood was perfectly placed and dried, they would have used an unknown technology to create a perfect, superficial, photographic negative body image that carefully avoided painting over the blood they had just applied. This sequence makes no logical sense for a forger. Why create the most obvious and easily verifiable part of the relic, the blood, first, and then risk ruining it with the difficult and mysterious process of creating the body image? The evidence of the blood points in two contradictory directions. Its chemistry screams authenticity, a real victim of a real crucifixion, but its relationship to the body image presents a logistical nightmare for any theory of human fabrication. The blood was there, waiting, before the ghost arrived. The blood presents a paradox that science cannot easily resolve, but another clue was hiding in plain sight, trapped in the very fibers of the linen. In the 1970s, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey was given a unique opportunity. He used adhesive tape to lift microscopic samples from the surface of the Shroud of Turin, hoping to capture dust and pollen that had settled on the cloth over its long history. What he claimed to find was a botanical roadmap. Frey identified numerous pollen grains from plant species that were native not to Europe, but to the arid environment around Jerusalem. He pointed to the presence of plants like the tumbleweed gundelia, a thorny shrub that thrives in the Holy Land. This was a stunning assertion. If Frey was correct, the pollen trail placed the physical presence of the shroud in 1st century Judea, directly challenging the medieval carbon dating. It suggested the linen had been in the very environment where the biblical crucifixion was said to have taken place, collecting a dusty, botanical signature that a European forger could never have replicated. For a time, this pollen evidence seemed like a powerful counter-argument to the carbon dating. a silent witness from the ancient world, but the scientific community is built on skepticism and verification. After Max Frey's death, his methods came under intense scrutiny. Other botanists re-examined his original slides and raised serious doubts. They argued that his identification of some key species was flawed, and more critically, they questioned the possibility of contamination. The shroud had been handled for centuries, displayed openly to millions of pilgrims, and restored multiple times. Could these pollen grains have been introduced much later, perhaps from the clothing of a traveler or the hands of a restorer? The controversy deepened when other researchers conducted their own studies. Some confirmed the presence of Middle Eastern pollen, while others found the evidence inconclusive or pointed to pollen from plants common all across Europe. The debate over the pollen became a microcosm of the entire shroud controversy. One side sees a compelling geographical fingerprint, a trail of dust leading directly back to Jerusalem. The other sees a case of wishful thinking, where ambiguous data is interpreted to fit a desired narrative, so we are left to weigh this evidence. Is the pollen on the shroud the ancient dust of the Holy Land, or is it the more recent dust of centuries of travel and veneration? This botanical mystery refuses to offer a simple answer, leaving us to wonder if the truth is woven into the cloth itself, or simply blown onto it by the winds of time. But the strangest property of the image is one you cannot see with your eyes alone. It is a secret code, a hidden dimension of information that remained locked within the cloth until two physicists, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, brought the tools of space exploration to bear on this ancient relic. Working with a team at the United States Air Force Academy in the 1970s, they performed a simple yet revolutionary experiment. They took the high-contrast photographs from Secondo Pia and fed them into a NASA instrument called a VP8 image analyzer. This machine was designed to interpret the light and dark areas in satellite photos, translating them into a three-dimensional map of a planetary surface. Where a photo was flat, the machine would render a flat surface. Where the photo held encoded depth information, the machine would generate hills and valleys. When they fed the shroud's image into the analyzer, something incredible happened. The machine did not produce a flat, distorted smear. It generated a perfectly proportioned, three-dimensional sculpture of a human body. The darkness of every single point on the image, from the tip of the nose to the recesses of the eye sockets, corresponded precisely to the distance the cloth would have been from a body lying beneath it. The nose, which would have been closest to the linen, appears darkest. The cheeks, sloping away, are lighter. The eye sockets, deepest of all, are the lightest areas of the face. This is not how any painting or drawing in human history works. An artist uses light and shadow to imply depth, but that artistic shading does not contain real spatial data. If you put the Mona Lisa through the same VP8 analyzer, you would get a distorted, lumpy mess because her shadows are an artist's interpretation, not a precise measurement of distance. The shroud's image, however, behaves like a perfect photographic negative of a real body, but with one crucial difference: it is a perfect topographical map. This three-dimensional property is arguably the single strongest scientific argument against a medieval forgery. It poses an impossible question. How could a forger, centuries before the concepts of photography or three-dimensional mapping were even imagined, create an image that not only looks like a man, but also holds a perfect, measurable data set of his body's exact contours? This is not a question of artistic skill. It is a question of possessing knowledge and technology that did not exist for another 500 years. The image on the cloth is not just a picture. It is a recording, a perfect fossil of a moment, waiting for the right technology to read its deepest secret. The anatomical details encoded in the cloth are a forensic pathologist's dream and a medieval forger's nightmare. Every wound tells a story of suffering, but it is a story written in a medical language that was not understood for over 1,000 years after the crucifixion. The man on the shroud displays over 100 distinct wounds, from his shoulders down to his calves. Each one is a small, dumbbell-shaped laceration, consistent with the Roman flagrum, a whip with 2 or 3 leather thongs, each tipped with pieces of lead or bone. These are not random slashes. Their placement reveals a terrifying precision. The wounds avoid the vital organs, the kidneys and the heart, concentrating on the back, shoulders, and legs. This was a calculated act of torture designed to inflict maximum pain and blood loss without causing immediate death. A physiological reality a medieval artist would have had no reason to know or depict so accurately. The positioning of the body itself holds another crucial clue. The rigor mortis, the stiffening of death, is perfectly captured. There is a distinct flexion in the knees and a slight lifting of one foot, a detail pathologists confirm is consistent with the body being fixed in a seated position for a period after death, exactly as it would have been laid in a tomb. This is a subtlety of post-mortem physiology that was completely unknown in the 14th century. Perhaps the most medically precise detail involves the blood and the spear wound. The dark stain on the side is complex. It shows a clear separation, a larger, darker circle of clotted blood surrounded by a thinner, lighter halo. Doctors and surgeons who have studied this note that this perfectly represents a post-mortem wound. The darker center is clotted blood from the pleural cavity, while the lighter ring is a separation of blood and serum, a watery fluid that settles out after death. This is not a simple splash of red paint. It is a precise biological event, captured in linen. Then there is the matter of the feet. The shroud shows a single wound in each foot, suggesting the man was nailed through the metatarsal bones, with one foot placed over the other, and a single large iron nail driven through both. This method of crucifixion is historically and forensically accurate, but it contradicts centuries of Christian art, which almost universally shows a nail in each foot. A medieval forger would have painted what he saw in the churches around him, not an anatomically correct version that no one had ever depicted. The hands present their own puzzle. The blood flows from the wounds on the forearms run at distinct, angled paths. This is because the nail was likely driven through the wrist, through a space known as Destats space, which would have supported the body's weight and severed the median nerve, causing the thumbs to contract inward. On the shroud, the thumbs are not visible, retracted into the palms. This level of neurological and anatomical detail was utterly beyond the medical knowledge of the Middle Ages. It would take the rise of modern forensic pathology to even begin to understand these clues, so we must confront a staggering possibility. The image on the Shroud of Turin is not an artist's interpretation of death. It is a precise medical record, a biological snapshot of a crucified man, containing layers of data that were invisible to the very people first accused of creating it. How could a forger paint what he could not possibly understand? For nearly 2,000 years, artists have given us a face for Jesus. He is often portrayed as a slender, almost delicate figure with fair skin and long, flowing hair. The man on the Shroud of Turin shatters that familiar image. He is powerfully built, standing approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, which was remarkably tall for a first-century man in Judea. His physique is robust, with a broad chest and strong, muscular legs, the body of a manual laborer, not an ethereal spirit. His hair is long, yes, but it is tied in a simple ponytail at the back, a common style for Jewish men of the period. His beard is short and forked. This is not the idealized, sanitized figure from Renaissance frescoes. This is a real man who lived a life of hard work and died a brutal death. This stark realism forces a fascinating question. How did a medieval forger, steeped in the artistic traditions of his time, manage to ignore every conventional depiction of Christ? Why would he invent a man who looks nothing like the iconic images found in every church across Europe? It would be like a modern artist creating a portrait of a famous celebrity that deliberately contradicts every known photograph. The choice makes no sense from the perspective of creating a believable relic for a medieval audience. They expected the Jesus they saw in their stained glass windows. The man on the shroud is a stranger to that tradition, yet he aligns remarkably well with a different source, historical description. An ancient letter, discovered from the Roman proconsul Lentulus, describes Jesus as having a face that inspires reverence and fear, with hair the color of wine and a beard of the same color. While the authenticity of this letter is debated, its description of a commanding, bearded man fits the shroud's image far better than the delicate Christs of later art. This collision between art and the shroud's reality extends to the very mechanics of the crucifixion. For centuries, Christian art has almost universally shown the nails driven through the palms of Jesus' hands. It is a powerful, symbolic image, but from a practical and anatomical standpoint, it is almost certainly wrong. The palms of the hands cannot support the weight of a human body hanging on a cross. The tendons and tissues would simply tear through, and the victim would fall. The shroud tells a different, more gruesome story. The blood flows on the forearms, not the hands. The stains are located near the wrists, pointing to the nail being driven through a small, strong space in the wrist known as distat space. This area, a cluster of small bones, is strong enough to bear the body's weight. It is a detail that was completely lost on medieval artists who painted what they felt was spiritually resonant, not what was forensically accurate. A forger would have painted the nails in the palms because that is what everyone believed. The shroud, however, presents a brutal, engineering-based reality that contradicts 700 years of artistic tradition. The feet present a similar puzzle. Traditional art shows a nail in each of Jesus' feet. The shroud, however, shows only a single wound in each foot. The evidence suggests the man's feet were placed one over the other, and a single, large iron nail was driven through both, pinning them to the vertical stake of the cross. This method is not only historically plausible for Roman executions, but it also explains the distinct angle of the blood flows seen on the cloth, flows that match a body hanging in gravity. Every detail on the shroud points toward a single, coherent narrative of a specific type of Roman execution. The artist would have had to be a master of forgotten forensic science, a historian of brutal Roman practices, and a rebel against his own era's iconic imagery, all at once. The image we see is either the result of an impossible confluence of anachronistic knowledge, or it is the direct, unmediated imprint of a real event, preserving a truth that art had forgotten. The shroud does not ask us to replace our faith with science, but to wonder if science has now uncovered the face that faith had long been seeking. But could a cloth condemned as a medieval fake have left its ghostly signature in a book created 100 years earlier? Tucked away in the National Library of Hungary is a manuscript known as the Hungarian Prayer Codex, dated to 1192. This ancient prayer book contains a series of beautifully illustrated scenes, but one image in particular has sent shivers through the world of shroud research. It depicts the burial of Jesus, and the cloth he is being wrapped in is strikingly unusual. It is not a plain sheet. The artist has meticulously drawn a distinct weaving pattern, a herringbone twill. This is the exact same complex weave found on the Shroud of Turin, a pattern that was uncommon for burial cloths in the 1st century and virtually unheard of for a medieval forger to invent. The parallels only grow more startling. On this illustrated shroud, the artist has drawn 4 small, identical burn marks in an L-shaped pattern. These are not random smudges. They are deliberate, symbolic representations of damage. When researchers compared this illustration to the actual Shroud of Turin, they found a perfect match. The real shroud bears a series of small, mirror image L-shaped burn holes along one of its edges, damage we know it sustained in the fire of 1532. The Pray Codex, created 340 years before that fire, appears to show the very same damage. This is a temporal paradox that defies simple explanation. How could an artist in the 12th century illustrate burn holes that would not officially happen to the cloth until the 16th century? The mysterious details continue within the illustration itself. The body being placed on the shroud is shown completely naked, a highly uncommon and even scandalous detail for medieval Christian art, which almost always depicted a loincloth. The man's hands are crossed, one over the other, placed low on the pelvis, precisely as they are on the Shroud of Turin, and most telling of all, the figure has no visible thumbs. This is not an artistic omission. It is a precise anatomical accuracy, reflecting the retraction of the thumbs caused by a nail driven through the wrist, severing the median nerve. This is a level of forensic knowledge that was completely absent from medieval medicine and art. The Hungarian Pray Codex stands as a silent, stubborn witness from a time before the shroud's official history began. It suggests that a cloth matching the Shroud of Turin's unique weave, its peculiar damage, and its baffling anatomical details was not only known, but was considered important enough to be meticulously recorded by an illuminator over a century before Sir Geoffroy de Charny presented his controversial relic in Lyre. This single manuscript does not prove the shroud's authenticity, but it shatters the simple narrative that it was a 14th century creation. It forces us to wonder what other secrets are still hidden in the dusty pages of history, waiting to be found. Secondo Pia's photographic negative did more than reveal a hidden portrait. It fundamentally rewrote the mystery of the shroud's creation. We are no longer looking for a painter or a craftsman. We are searching for a process, an event that could imprint a perfect, natural photographic negative onto linen. This single property, the negative image, has become the cornerstone for the most compelling and controversial theories about the shroud's origin. If it is not a painting, then what force could have transferred such a detailed, information-rich image? Many researchers point toward a sudden, intense burst of energy, a flash of light. Think of the shroud as a piece of photographic film placed inside a giant camera. For an image to appear on that film, it needs a source of light. The theory suggests that for a fraction of a second, a massive, directional release of light or another form of radiant energy emanated from the body itself, scorching the cloth in perfect proportion to the distance each part of the linen was from the body. The nose, being closest, received the most intense energy and appears darkest. The cheeks, further away, received less. This perfectly accounts for the image's unique three-dimensional encoding, a property the VP8 analyzer would later confirm. But what kind of event could produce such a brief, yet incredibly precise, flash of energy? For many of the faithful, this points directly to the moment of resurrection described in the New Testament, a divine event of unimaginable power. The hypothesis is that the resurrection was not a quiet, spiritual transition, but a physical, energetic phenomenon. In this transformative instant, the body may have emitted a blast of light or radiation, burning its image onto the surrounding burial cloth before it dematerialized or transformed. This would explain why the image is a perfect negative, why there are no brush strokes, and why the bloodstains were already in place, undisturbed by the image-forming event. The blood was there first, and then, in a flash, the body's likeness was seared onto the cloth around it. Scientists exploring this idea have looked for natural processes that could mimic such an effect. Some have experimented with corona discharge, a type of electrical phenomenon that can create superficial, straw yellow discolorations on linen. Others have proposed a rapid, localized heating event. Yet, no experiment has successfully replicated the shroud's image in all its complexity, its perfect resolution, and its chemical purity. The process remains just beyond our scientific grasp, a phenomenon that seems to require a confluence of factors we cannot yet reproduce in a laboratory. This leaves us standing at the intersection of faith and physics. The negative image is a fact. Its three-dimensional data is a fact. The absence of any known medieval technology to create it is a fact. Whether you see this as evidence of a miraculous resurrection or an as yet unknown natural event, the implication is staggering. The Shroud of Turin appears to be the direct, physical record of a single, instantaneous moment, a perfect shadow cast not by the absence of light, but by its overwhelming and mysterious presence. The fire that should have erased the shroud from history only deepened its mystery. In the deep night of December 4th, 1532, a devastating blaze erupted in the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry, France, where the relic was kept. The heat was so intense that it melted the silver reliquary, the protective casket designed to keep the cloth safe. Molten metal, glowing and liquid, dripped from the edges of the casket and splashed directly onto the folded linen inside. This was not a gentle scorching. The silver burned through the cloth in several places, leaving a series of identical, mirror image L-shaped holes. At the same time, the desperate efforts to douse the flames caused another kind of damage. Water, likely mixed with chemicals from the firefighting process, was poured onto the smoldering casket. This water soaked into the cloth, leaving large, symmetrical stains that are still visible today, dark patches that frame the image of the man. The shroud was pulled from the ashes, scarred but intact. It was a survivor. The task of repairing this precious, damaged relic fell to a group of poor Clare nuns. These skilled women performed what was, for their time, a masterwork of textile restoration. They carefully patched the burn holes by sewing new pieces of linen, a backing cloth, onto the back of the shroud. Then, with incredible patience, they re-wove the damaged areas, interlacing new threads with the old to fill the gaps left by the fire. Their work was so fine, so nearly invisible to the naked eye, that it would go largely unnoticed for centuries. This event, this near destruction and repair, is not just a dramatic chapter in the shroud's history. It is the absolute core of the scientific argument against the radiocarbon dating results. Critics of the 1988 tests point directly to the fire's aftermath. They propose that the molten silver and the water used to extinguish the blaze fundamentally altered the chemistry of the linen fibers. The intense, localized heat could have caused a process called thermal polymerization, essentially baking new carbon isotopes from the fire's smoke into the very fabric of the cloth. Since radiocarbon dating measures the ratio of carbon isotopes, this massive infusion of new medieval carbon would have made the ancient linen appear hundreds of years younger than it actually is. The water, potentially drawn from a local well rich in dissolved minerals, could have carried its own load of younger carbon, further contaminating the sample. And then there is the repair itself. The carbon sample was taken from a single corner of the shroud, an area that shows significant water staining and is near one of the patches. What if the scientists did not cut their sample from the original first-century cloth? What if instead their tiny piece of linen came from one of the nearly invisible areas expertly rewoven by the poor Clare nuns in the 16th century? If that was the case, then the carbon dating did not test the Shroud of Turin at all. It tested a medieval repair patch. The fire of Chambéry, an event meant to destroy the relic, may have instead created the perfect conditions for a scientific misunderstanding, leaving us to wonder if we dated the cloth, or merely the ghost of its near destruction. The challenge of recreating the shroud's image has become a scientific and artistic obsession. For decades, researchers have tried to become that hypothetical medieval forger, attempting to replicate the cloth's properties, using only materials and knowledge available in the 14th century. One of the most persistent methods is the bas relief technique. An artist takes a stone or wooden statue of a man, covers it with a piece of linen, and then gently rubs the cloth with a pigment, like a thin paste of ochre. The result is an image, yes, but it is fundamentally wrong. The pigment soaks into the cloth, creating a blurry, directional smear. Where the cloth touched the statue most directly, you get a dark patch. Where it draped loosely, the image fades. This creates a crude, two-dimensional image, not the precise distance-encoded map found on the shroud. The bas relief method fails on every critical point. It cannot create the superficial, fiber-deep coloration. It cannot avoid the capillary action that makes the image fuzzy, and it completely lacks the three-dimensional information that the VP8 analyzer so clearly reads from the original. Other experimenters have tried using acids or chemical vapors to stain linen. By placing a damp cloth over a heated bas relief statue, they can cause a chemical reaction that browns the fibers. This gets a little closer to the superficial nature of the shroud's image, but it still fails to capture the resolution and the perfect gradation of color. The image looks blotchy and artificial, lacking the subtle, lifelike transitions of the original. The chemical stains also tend to be directional, following the path of the vapor, something completely absent from the shroud, where the image appears uniformly from every angle, with no brush strokes or application marks. In the modern era, scientists have turned to more powerful tools, attempting to explain the image through a sudden burst of energy. Researchers have used ultraviolet lasers and short bursts of radiation to try and scorch the topmost fibers of linen. These experiments have produced some of the most promising results, creating faint, superficial discolorations that do not penetrate the cloth. Yet even these high-tech attempts fall short. They cannot replicate the sheer complexity of the shroud's image, its perfect resolution, or its precise correlation to body cloth distance. The energy required is so finely tuned and directional that reproducing it across an entire human form with such perfection remains beyond our capabilities. Every single replica, whether born from medieval techniques or cutting-edge laboratories, misses the mark. They might capture one or two of the shroud's properties, but never the entire, baffling suite of characteristics all at once. The image remains a perfect storm of optical, chemical, and dimensional data that no one has been able to forge, even with all the advantages of modern science. So we are left with a haunting possibility. If the greatest minds and most advanced technology of the 21st century cannot recreate this object, what does that say about the chances of a lone artist pulling it off over 600 years ago? The failed replicas do not prove a miracle, but they do build a powerful case for the impossible. So where does the institution at the very heart of this mystery stand? The Catholic Church's relationship with the Shroud of Turin is a masterclass in careful balance. While millions of the faithful venerate the cloth as one of the most sacred objects in Christendom, the Church itself has never officially proclaimed its authenticity. It holds the shroud in its possession, protects it, and allows it to be displayed, yet it consistently steps back from making any definitive doctrinal claim. This is not a position of doubt, but one of profound theological nuance. The Church seems to be saying that the ultimate mystery of the resurrection is beyond the proof or disproof of any physical object. In 1998, during a public exhibition, Pope John Paul II articulated this stance with a single, powerful word. He called the shroud an icon. This was a deliberate and significant choice of language. In the Church's view, a relic is a physical object directly associated with a saint or Jesus himself, like a bone fragment or a piece of the true cross. An icon, however, is something different. It is a sacred image that points the believer toward a deeper spiritual truth. It is a window into the divine, not the divine itself. By defining the shroud as an icon, the Pope was acknowledging its immense spiritual power without binding the core of Christian faith to its scientific authenticity. He was essentially saying that this cloth, whether it wrapped the body of Christ or not, serves to inspire contemplation on the passion, the suffering, and the ultimate sacrifice. Its value lies in what it directs the human heart to consider, not in what it can prove to the human eye. This careful neutrality has allowed the Church to be a surprising patron of science. It is precisely because faith does not depend on the shroud that the Church has repeatedly permitted and even facilitated rigorous scientific testing. From the extensive examination by the Shroud of Turin research project in the 1970s to the controversial carbon dating in 1988, the Vatican gave its consent. The message was clear: we are not afraid of what science may find, because our faith rests on a foundation that cannot be shaken by a laboratory result. This creates a fascinating dynamic where the Church, often perceived as an opponent of scientific inquiry, has become the guardian of an object that continually pushes the boundaries of science. The official stance is one of reverent agnosticism. It encourages the faithful to see the shroud as a profound mirror of the Gospels, a visual representation of the story they already believe, while leaving the question of its origin open for personal reflection and scientific exploration. The Church does not need the shroud to be real, but it recognizes that for many, this mysterious linen makes the ancient story feel devastatingly, humanly real. The world of the shroud has its own name, syndenology, a field of study as unique as the cloth it investigates. This is not a casual hobby, but a dedicated international community of scientists, historians, textile experts, and theologians, all drawn by the same enigma. They gather at formal conferences, presenting papers in rooms where fervent believers and hardened skeptics debate over spectral analysis and first-century pollen grains. Peer-reviewed journals publish their findings, lending academic weight to a mystery that straddles the line between faith and physics. This is a world where a botanist might passionately argue with a nuclear physicist over the chemical composition of a 2,000-year-old bloodstain, and a forensic pathologist might spend a career analyzing the precise angle of a wound depicted on a linen canvas. The debates within this community are fierce and deeply personal. One faction may champion the validity of the radiocarbon dating, while another presents complex chemical arguments for contamination. A new theory about image formation through a corona discharge is met with rigorous scrutiny and attempts at replication. These are not abstract arguments. They are passionate quests for a truth that has eluded humanity for centuries. What unites them all, despite their disagreements, is a shared conviction that this single piece of cloth is worth a lifetime of study. They are the detectives on a case that has no statute of limitations, sifting through the evidence left behind, searching for that one clue that could finally unlock the secret held within the fibers. Yet for all the scientific marvel, the case for a medieval forgery presents a powerful and pragmatic counter-narrative. The bedrock of this argument is the radiocarbon dating. 3 separate world-class laboratories, operating under strict scientific protocols, independently arrived at the same conclusion. The flax that wove the shroud was growing in a field between 1260 and 1390. This is not a single, questionable data point. It is a triple verified fact that places the cloth's origin precisely in the historical window when it first appeared in Lyre. For skeptics, this is the cornerstone that supports everything else. How then could such an object exist? The answer lies not in miracles, but in the ingenuity of a brilliant, unknown artist. One compelling theory suggests the forger used a technology that was, in fact, available in the 14th century, the camera obscura. This simple device is nothing more than a dark room or box with a small pinhole that projects an inverted image of the outside world onto an opposite wall. It was known to ancient scholars and was used by artists to trace projections. A skilled operator could have used a camera obscura to project the image of a model, or perhaps even a corpse, onto a treated linen canvas. The faint, negative image would then be fixed using a light-sensitive chemical compound. We know that silver nitrate, a substance that darkens upon exposure to light, was known to alchemists of the era. By painting a linen with a solution of silver nitrate and then exposing it to a projected image for an extended period, a forger could have created a permanent photographic imprint. This would elegantly explain the shroud's negative properties and its lack of brushstrokes. It would have been an incredible, secret experiment in proto-photography, centuries ahead of its time. Another method often proposed is the bas-relief technique. Using a chemical transfer, an artist could have created a stone or wooden statue of a crucified man, then draped a moistened linen over it. He might have then gently rubbed the cloth with a mixture containing myrrh and aloes, substances traditionally associated with burial and known to leave a yellowish stain. Some researchers have even suggested that a mild acid could have been used to chemically burn the fibers, creating a superficial, straw-colored image. To account for the three-dimensional data, the forger might have intuitively understood that the parts of the cloth touching the statue would stain more darkly, while the draped areas would be lighter, accidentally encoding a crude form of spatial information. But why would anyone go to such extraordinary lengths? The motivation is clear and deeply human, a combination of profit, power, and piety. The 14th century was a golden age for relics. A church or a noble family that possessed a major relic could attract thousands of pilgrims, and with them, vast donations and immense political influence. For Geoffroy de Charny, a knight seeking to establish his legacy and fund his local church, commissioning a masterwork relic could have been a calculated act of devotion and ambition. The artist, in turn, would have been handsomely rewarded for creating an object so powerful it would inspire generations. This hypothesis paints a picture not of a cynical fraud, but of a profound deception born from a desire to make the divine tangible. The forger, in this view, was a genius who used every tool at his disposal to create an object of ultimate faith, an icon so perfect that its very creation would become the very mystery it was designed to represent. The fragile peace between science and guardianship shattered in the year 2002. In a secretive operation, a team of textile experts was granted access to the Shroud of Turin to perform what they termed a restoration. For 24 days, they worked behind closed doors, making a series of irreversible decisions. They carefully removed the centuries-old patches sewn on by the Poor Clare nuns after the fire of 1532. They detached the precious backing cloth, a historical artifact in its own right that had protected the shroud's underside for hundreds of years, and then they pressed the entire linen flat, ironing out the centuries of gentle folds that were part of its physical history. To the custodians, this was a necessary conservation project, a way to preserve the cloth for future generations by removing non-original elements and stabilizing its structure. But when the scientific community learned what had been done, the reaction was one of sheer horror. Critics accused the team of committing an act of archaeological vandalism. By removing the patches and the backing cloth, they had destroyed a priceless historical record. Those medieval repairs were not just fabric, they were a timeline. The threads used, the weaving techniques, even the dust trapped between the layers could have been analyzed to provide a clearer history of the shroud's journey and its various restorations. That evidence was now gone forever. The act of pressing the cloth flat was similarly condemned. The subtle, three-dimensional topography of the linen. The very hills and valleys that corresponded with the body image had been physically altered. While the image itself remained, the cloth that held it was now fundamentally different, its natural state lost to an industrial press. The most severe criticism, however, centered on contamination. The restoration process, no matter how careful, introduced modern human handling on an unprecedented scale. Skin cells, clothing fibers, and chemical traces from the modern laboratory environment were now irrevocably bonded with the ancient linen. This massive, modern contamination made the prospect of any future definitive testing, especially a new radiocarbon dating, almost impossible. Any new sample would be hopelessly polluted with 21st century carbon, rendering the results meaningless. This single, well-intentioned project had effectively locked the door on potentially solving the mystery with more advanced future technology. The 2002 restoration stands as a stark warning of the conflict between preservation and investigation. In trying to save the shroud, did its guardians inadvertently erase the very clues that could have one day revealed its ultimate secret? The fabric itself holds clues woven into its very structure. The Shroud of Turin is a single sheet of linen, measuring approximately 14 feet long by 3.5 feet wide, woven in a complex pattern known as a 3-to-1 herringbone twill. To the untrained eye, it might look like a simple diagonal weave, but this specific pattern is like a fingerprint. It involves the weft threads passing over 3 warp threads and then under one, creating a distinctive, zigzagging V-shape across the cloth. In the ancient world, this was not a common or simple textile to produce. It required a skilled weaver and a more sophisticated loom, marking it as a high-quality and likely expensive piece of fabric. This single detail, the herringbone twill, sits at the center of a fierce historical debate. Was this the kind of cloth a wealthy man like Joseph of Arimathea would have used for an honorable burial in 1st century Jerusalem? Or does this specific weave point unmistakably to a later European origin? The answer is tangled in the threads of archaeology. Textile finds from the Roman era in Judea are incredibly rare due to the region's climate and soil conditions, which cause organic materials like linen to decay. However, the evidence we do have from sites like Masada presents a complicated picture. Some fragments of linen from that period and region show a simple, plain weave, not a herringbone twill. This has led many skeptics to argue that the shroud's complex weave is an anachronism, a detail a medieval forger would have used because it was a familiar, high-quality fabric in his own time. Yet, this is not the full story. Other archaeological discoveries have muddied the waters. A textile fragment found in the tombs of the Jewish patriarchs near Jerusalem was, in fact, a herringbone twill. While its exact dating is debated, it demonstrates that the weaving technique was known and used in the Near East. Furthermore, linen herringbone twill has been identified in artifacts from the Roman era found in other parts of the empire. So the argument is not that the weave was impossible in the 1st century, but that it was uncommon, especially for a humble burial shroud. A medieval artist, however, would have been surrounded by herringbone twills in everything from fine clothing to church vestments. For him, it would have been a natural choice for an important relic. So we are left with a textile riddle. Does the shroud's linen point to a rare, expensive burial cloth from antiquity? Or does it simply reflect the common high-quality fabrics of the 14th century? The weave is a fact, but its testimony is frustratingly ambiguous, a pattern that fits 2 different histories equally well. Beyond the laboratories and theological debates, the Shroud of Turin has woven itself into the very fabric of our global culture. It is a recurring star in best-selling novels, a central mystery in countless documentaries, and a potent symbol that sparks imagination far outside the walls of churches or museums. Its iconic image, that haunting negative of a suffering man, is instantly recognizable to millions who may never have studied a single scientific paper about it. This transformation from a disputed relic into a full-blown cultural phenomenon is a story in itself. The shroud fuels everything from profound spiritual pilgrimages to elaborate conspiracy theories, existing simultaneously as a sacred object for the faithful and an irresistible puzzle for the skeptical. When it goes on public display in Turin, the city braces for an influx of millions of visitors from every corner of the world. These are not just tourists, they are pilgrims on a personal quest, standing in lines that stretch for hours for a fleeting moment before the glass case. They seek connection, affirmation, or simply the chance to be in the presence of an enduring enigma. For them, the cloth is a tangible bridge to the divine, a physical anchor for a 2,000-year-old story. Yet, in the very same crowd, you will find the curious, the doubtful, and the fervent investigators who see not a miracle, but the ultimate cold case. The shroud's power lies in this perfect duality. It serves as a blank screen onto which we project our deepest questions about history, science, and the nature of belief itself. It inspires both reverent silence and fierce public debate. In the world of fiction, it is a perfect MacGuffin, a plot device that can drive thrillers about secret societies, time travel stories, or apocalyptic narratives. Each retelling, whether in a blockbuster film or a detailed YouTube analysis, adds another layer to its modern mythos. The shroud is no longer just an artifact locked away in a cathedral. It has become a living idea, a conversation that spans continents and ideologies. It asks us not merely to decide if it is real or fake, but to reflect on why we are so captivated by the unknown. What does our enduring fascination with this piece of linen say about our timeless need for mystery in an age of information? Even with centuries of scrutiny, the Shroud of Turin guards its core secrets with silent defiance. The fundamental question remains a scientific chasm. How was this image formed? We know what it is not. It is not a painting, a scorch, or a stain. It is a superficial, chemical change to the cellulose fibers themselves, a perfect negative encoding three-dimensional data. The leading hypothesis suggests a rapid Maillard reaction, the same process that browns food, triggered by a brief, intense burst of energy, but no experiment has replicated the image's full complexity, its resolution, and its precise correlation to body-cloth distance. What kind of event could produce such a controlled, full-body flash, a phenomenon that essentially turned the linen into a piece of photographic film centuries before the concept existed? This mystery is inextricably linked to the baffling carbon-14 dating. Can that medieval result be reconciled with the mountain of forensic and chemical evidence pointing toward an ancient origin? The debate now centers on the contamination hypothesis, the idea that the fire of 1532 or subsequent repairs infused the linen with younger carbon, skewing the results. Researchers continue to model how thermal events and chemical contamination could have reset the cloth's radiocarbon clock, but proving it definitively requires access to new samples, a prospect made far more difficult after the controversial restoration in 2002. The quest for answers is far from over. New, non-invasive spectroscopic techniques are being developed, capable of mapping the chemical composition of the cloth at a molecular level across its entire surface. These advanced scans could potentially identify different regions of the linen based on their chemical fingerprints, possibly distinguishing original sections from medieval repairs. There is also persistent discussion among scientists about the potential for a new radiocarbon test, one that would use accelerated mass spectrometry to date multiple samples from different parts of the cloth, including the main body far from the edges, while using chemical pretreatments designed to strip away any potential contaminants. Would such a test finally deliver a unanimous verdict, or would it only deepen the divide, revealing an even more complex and patchwork history? The enduring enigma of the Shroud ensures that the silent dialogue between faith and science, between the medieval and the miraculous, is a conversation that is still being written. We have walked through a labyrinth of science and history, tracing every thread of this ancient linen, from the shocking negative in Secondo Pia's darkroom to the meticulous probes of modern laboratories. The evidence pulls us in two irreconcilable directions. On one hand, a medieval carbon date stands as a stark, scientific fact. On the other, a chorus of forensic, chemical, and historical details screams of a first-century origin, and an image that defies all known methods of forgery. There is no final verdict waiting for us at the end of this journey, only a more profound and humbling mystery. The Shroud of Turin, in its silent defiance, does not ask for your faith or your skepticism. It asks for your wonder. It forces us to stand at the very edge of our understanding, peering into the abyss between what we can prove and what we feel to be true. Whether this cloth is the sacred burial linen of a divine resurrection or the impossibly brilliant work of a forgotten medieval genius, its true power may lie not in the answer it provides, but in the questions it forces us to ask about history, science, and the eternal human search for meaning. The evidence is now yours to weigh. What do you believe lies woven into these fibers? Share your own conclusion in the comments below. The conversation, like the mystery itself, is far from over.